In late 2017, I noticed a mysterious icon on my desktop. It was a read-only file in a format I'd never heard of before. I opened it to find a brief note, black on white in plain text. Gone. It's gone forever. I had no earthly idea how the file got there. I don't share my computer with anyone, and I'm sure I didn't download the thing. But at the same time, it was familiar. I'd repeated some version of this phrase to myself every day for the past year as I came out, outed an abusive ex-partner, lost most of my friends over it, started college, started hormones, spun completely out of control, and watched my plans for the future disintegrate. I decided the file was a sign, dropped onto my computer by some force beyond my reckoning, insisting that my feelings were real. I felt like it saw me in a way almost nobody did. And I carried that reassurance with me for years as I tried to get back on track. I'm really glad I found it. But of course, the universe doesn't drop a file onto your desktop to send you a message. It had to come from somewhere. This is a video about gender, science, and what we lose when we know. The past couple years have seen a lot of clamor around the idea of transness as a social contagion, of rapid onset gender dysphoria as a mass psychogenic illness infecting teenagers left and right. It seems like there are more trans people now than there used to be, and some very normal people have some very normal concerns about the whole thing. You know, the thing where we exist. It's not ideal for them. Maybe we should ease up. But for all the talk of social contagions, people rarely believe that transness is exclusively a social phenomenon. Even if you think being trans is a fake thing, you believe certain factors predispose people to, I guess, fall for it. And so alongside all this talk of social influence, there's been an increased push to find an objective physical cause of trans identity, independent of any cultural influence. Really, this has been underway since at least the 90s, and theories by this point abound. Some studies suggest that trans identity is caused by specific genes, others by the number of cells in a certain part of the brain. These dry scientific hypotheses appear fairly nonpartisan, and they obscure how loaded the question really is. While the scientific method itself isn't political, what we choose to study is totally inextricable from politics. You know, we never commission studies on why people are cis. We understand that as the natural course of development for a person, as what happens when all goes to plan without any outside interference. But of course, everyone's genders are shaped by their social context. Being cis is actively enforced on all of us from birth, in a process known as forced cissification. Google it. To say that only transness must have a discrete cause is othering no matter how neutrally it's framed, because it understands transness as external to normal human development. It reminds me of the search for a cause of same-gender attraction, or a cause of autism for that matter. Those communities both largely reject the search for a cause, because an answer would be an enormous liability with very little upside. There's really no doubt as to how the results would be applied. Take it from professional homophobe Orson Scott Card. Our scientific efforts, I've never heard an interview. I don't actually know how he talks. I've assumed he's British. He's not British, is he? Our scientific efforts in regard to homosexuality should be to identify genetic and uterine causes, as well as environmental and social influences that put their children at greater risk of this reproductive dysfunction, so that the incidence of this dysfunction can be minimized. If acceptable ways can be found to protect children from developing this reproductive dysfunction before it even manifests itself, or to shape society as to encourage the least effective to achieve reproductive success, i.e. evolutionary normality, why would we not want to assure that the children we bear would be free of this dysfunction? Fucking dick. Just some of the most pro-eugenic speech around. I promise this video gets like fun and cool soon. It's mostly not about bigotry, but this feels like important groundwork to lay. Anyway. As with other stigmatized ways of being, identifying a cause behind transness would empower parents and lobbyists to directly decrease the number of trans people in the world. If it were found to be caused by the environment you grew up in, campaigns to ban our books and criminalize drag queens would kick into overdrive. If we found strong genetic predictors of transness, prejudiced families would screen for them in utero and abort fetuses deemed to be at risk. And all those militantly anti-abortion people, well, they're usually also anti-queer, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of them were willing to look the other way. Orson Scott Card, for example, is vocally anti-abortion. And yet, in that quote a minute ago, he was kind of implying we should screen and abort gay babies. We know a prenatal marker would engender this kind of choice because we've seen it happen before. When medical ultrasounds rolled out in the 60s and 70s, prospective parents gained the ability to check the sex of the fetus they were carrying, and if they found out the child would turn out female, many of them would have an abortion, with the idea that having a son would be easier or more financially beneficial. This trend brought on a demographic crisis in a lot of countries. At its most extreme, 118 sons were born for every 100 daughters in China, which scholars worried might increase violence and oppression against women in the long run. So, in 1994, China and India both banned fetal sex screenings to put an end to this practice. Though I should mention the bans may have themselves caused issues for women. Now, the science at play here was neutral. Ultrasounds are obviously not morally wrong, but the availability of sex screenings still caused harm. Similarly, a detectable cause of transness would be a big, bright target on our backs. And that's a major reason some civilians want to track one down. Now, this is a pretty clear-cut argument for not pursuing the question any further, but it's not actually the focus of this essay. I don't want to spend too much time on the search for a cause, because no matter what science we use, I don't think we'll actually find one. Before we get into that, this video took a staggering amount of research to pull off. Over the last month, I've read scientific papers, essays dating back to the 30s, parts of 6 different books on psychology, theology, demographics, and I love doing it this way. I don't think this channel would work if it was low effort. But honestly, folks, I'm just barely skirting by. If you like the work I do and you have the means to contribute, it'd be a huge help if you join my Patreon. You can get your name in the credits, in-depth production diaries, and early access to all my videos. Okay, hate doing that. Back to the video. The past 30 plus years of biology research have yielded a laundry list of weak to moderate correlations, none of which are known to cause trans identity, so much as coincide with it in some cases. We generally believe the hormones you receive in the womb go on to impact your gender, but this theory doesn't map cleanly onto trans men. We also think genetics play a role, but we found that if an identical twin is trans, the other twin with the exact same DNA turns out to be trans a cool 20% of the time. One of our sturdiest conclusions, found in at least 6 different studies, is that trans women are more likely to be left-handed than everyone else. So, if we spent another 30 years looking for a cause, I expect we'd end up with a bunch more fairly uncompelling correlations, which is exactly what's happened with the causes of same-sex attraction and autism. Researchers have proposed dozens of factors, spanning everything from parenting styles to gut disease, which they've argued can contribute in small ways, but they've never found anything close to a silver bullet.
I think we both know that vaccines cause autism.
Vaccine? Oh.
Your video is wrong, really.
Of course, real harm can be done even without a perfect answer. Like, if the best they can do is find a rare gene where 30% of carriers end up coming out as trans, that still empowers people who want to target us. And I tend to think that's the most realistic scenario, because the question is far more layered than it lets on. The cause implies there's only one cause, or at least one factor that's much more influential than the rest. But there are actually uncountably many factors at play here. When we ask what made a given person trans, we're actually asking at least 3 different questions, not just about the individual, but about the society they live in. 1, what was the catalyst of their transness? The most primal cause before any cultural interference. Our assumption that it's biological is steeped in Western cultural influence. Ever since the scientific method started edging out religion in daily life, we've tended to assume that everything about everything is physically observable. This idea is called physicalism. Kind of boring. Anyway, applying a simple ideological kind of physicalism to humans, it's easy to think that everything about a person is baked into their genetics and determined at the moment of conception. This is a really effective way to make cultural forces like sexism, racism, and classism look preordained. Women are naturally reliant on men. Black people are genetically predisposed to live in poverty. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Our current gender system starts from the belief that our bodies define our genders, and that we're intrinsically drawn to gender roles based on our bodies. By that logic, if something is wrong with a person's gender, something must be wrong with their body. But there are things we can't point to on the body that may well be bigger factors. Our pasts, our social classes, how people relate to us out in the world. Furthermore, if there are biological differences between cis and trans people, they could be the result of our transness rather than the cause. There's been a lot of clamor about a few studies that found trans women's brains to be closer to cis women's brains in certain ways, but all the trans women in those studies had already medically transitioned, which, changes the body. That's kind of the whole thing, too. How does society interpret gender variance to identify trans people as a discrete category that can be judged collectively? There's no definitive answer to who is trans and who isn't, because the category of trans is blurry and constantly evolving. Many people we describe as trans today would have described themselves as drag queens, cross-dressers, or butches 50 years ago. Even community icons like Marsha P. Johnson never used the word to describe themselves. Nowadays, the trans umbrella includes a huge variety of people who often have drastically different feelings about gender. Personally, I think of my identity as an outgrowth of this need to have a different body and live in a different gender role. Many people only want to live in a different gender role. Others are happy changing their name and pronouns without changing much about their lives. And others still probably could be cisgender, but reject the gender binary on political grounds. In the 1970s, we started merging into a broad coalition, the transgender community, because we're all targeted for the same reasons. But that shouldn't be taken to mean we're a monolith. Our identities have such radically different implications that if we didn't share the label, I doubt anyone would expect to find a common factor between, a surged up T-girl, a gender abolitionist feminist, and a dangly earring he-they. Well, we're all kind of hot, there's that. Taking it a step further, while gender variance is found all over the world, not that many cultures have ideas that translate directly to transgender. Take, for example, Ojibwe tradition, which understands the European concepts of sexual orientation, gender presentation, and gender roles to be kind of part of the same thing. Basically, what role a person holds in their community. So, women who excel in typically male work, men who live as women, masculine men attracted to other men, are all understood to carry two gendered spirits instead of one. Thus the modern umbrella term two-spirit, which isn't transness, but a different way of looking at gender variance. It's pretty easy to make a case that the cultural force identifying people as transgender, specifically, is our society that offers up transgender as a framework for who we are and what we do. 3. What made it possible for them to realize they were different and actually move through the world as a trans person? Although some people just know they're trans from a young age and declare it before they even really understand the implications, it's not most of us. Most of us take cues from our environments in choosing to first accept ourselves as trans and then come out. This too is 100% down to culture. Nothing meaningful about human biology has changed in the last 100 years, but there are more openly trans people now than before because being openly trans is more feasible. That's why the social contagion myth is so seductive. It looks to some people like the trans rights movement has caused many people to be trans, who otherwise would have been, normal girls who are pink and don't have gaping holes in their abdomens. All three of these questions are complicated, and there's no reason to believe they would all have the same answer. I think the real reason a given person is trans must involve some biological predisposition, some cultural understanding of gender variance, some safety and ability to come out, and some amount of personality and ideology. With such a generous heaping of randomness that predicting the outcome is a total crapshoot. The 2 meta-reviews I've read, both published in the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Mental Health, seem to agree with me. Oh, the meta-reviews agree with her. Great. I always do this. I always dive into these questions and explain why it's actually really complicated and there's no one clear answer. What is sex? At least 6 different things. What are women? Yes. And I think it's true, but it's also clunky and unsatisfying. I end up running into what I call the t-shirt problem. You're telling me sex is these 6 things and some aren't binary and some are a social construct? How am I going to fit that on a t-shirt? Well, the full story is definitely more accurate. It also somehow feels like shakier footing. It makes it impossible to explain why, I am trans, specifically, which is a question I wish I had an answer to sometimes. And maybe as a response to this issue, the impractical complexity of gender, a fair number of trans people also seek out a simple answer, especially a biological one, with the hope that that would legitimize us. Every single theory I've heard from a transphobe, I've also heard from a trans person. Genetics, prenatal hormones, brain shape, innate brokenness. In the community, a crude physicalism hobbles forward, insisting that if our identity can be pinpointed in the body, that settles the argument. It's real. We're real. We were born this way, baby. We're taught to think of social forces as less material, and therefore as much shakier foundations upon which to build identities. So even among us, There's an incentive to argue that gender is, in fact, an immutable physical trait. I think a lot of these people are in pain. Maybe they feel unmoored in a world that doesn't make room for them, and want something unambiguous to tether them to reality. A story that dispels any doubts they or others might harbor. See, my body is my gender just like you. If only it were so simple. I experience my body as a contradiction whose resolution is visible but just out of reach. I'll chase my ideal self forever and it'll stay on the horizon forever. Logically, I know there's nothing wrong with my body. Its defects are social mirages, but I see them anyway. Lots of us do. And as with any other difficult fact of life, we need to integrate it. We need it to make sense on some level. Framing transness as a physical defect can be comforting because it validates our suffering and forces us to relinquish responsibility for it. It doesn't say we suffer because we deserve to, but because there's simply no other way. We were born broken and will never achieve perfect repair. This idea carries a lot of religious baggage, I think, though it pretends to be coldly scientific. Fittingly, easily the best expression of it I've come across came from a rabbi named Kalonymus ben Kalonymus, who was active in the early 14th century. There's a debate over which pronoun to use for Kalonymus, but I'm going to use she because it's my channel. She wrote this absolutely stunning layered poem called Prayer for Transformation that alternates between yearning for a life as a woman and cursing the world for making it impossible. Oh, but had the artisan who made me created me instead a worthy woman, today I would be wise and insightful. We would weave, my friends and I, and in the moonlight spin our yarn and tell stories to one another from dusk till midnight. We tell of the events of our day, silly things, matters of no consequence. But also, I would grow very wise from the spinning, and I would say, how lucky am I to know how to make linen, how to comb wool and weave lace, to design cup-like buds, open flowers, cherubim, palm trees, and all sorts of other fine things, colorful embroideries, and furrow-like stitches. This life sounds so wonderful. There must be some reason it's out of reach. There must be something. Skipping to the end now. What shall I say? Why cry or be bitter? If my Father in heaven has decreed upon me and has maimed me with an immutable deformity, then I do not wish to remove it. The sorrow of the impossible is a human pain that nothing will cure and for which no comfort can be found. So I will bear and suffer until I die and wither in the ground. Since I have learned from our tradition that we bless both the good and the bitter, I will bless in a voice hushed and weak. Blessed are you, Yahweh, who has not made me a woman. It just breaks my heart. And I don't know what else she could have done, right? For a 14th century rabbi, I'm sure it made sense to accept the suffering as preordained and integrate it into her worldview. Today's trans pathologies are similar, but substitute faith in God for faith in an as yet unseen science. A hypothesized genetic mutation, a mental illness, a disruption in the womb, each one basically a curse in a lab coat. Despite its scientific veneer, there's no reason to believe these theories are truer than any other. The properly scientific answer is that we don't know, and I think people only insist otherwise because they feel a point of origin would offer them meaning. I want to share an excerpt from one of my new favorite essays, Archetypal Transsexuality, published in 1995 by Rachel Pollack, who incidentally died a couple months ago. To describe transsexual people as dupes of the medical profession, or slaves to social conditioning, or trapped in rigid ideas about gender roles, is precisely to take away our power, a power so intense that it terrifies people. And because the dual acts of changing gender and altering the body frighten them, they try to think of an explanation. He must hate himself so much. She can't accept the role society has given her. Her parents must have abused her. Each of these statements, and all the others, assume that the transsexual man or woman doesn't really know what he or she is doing. And more, they shift the focus from transsexuality itself to some external concept or ideology. All explanations, even friendly ones, drain away the passion of the experience. To me, the search for a cause of transness reads like a spiritually deprived society struggling against a force its logic can't easily explain. The way trans people move through the world, without an obvious cause but so steadfast anyway, casts doubt on this idea we stake so much on, that humans can understand everything if we try. What if, instead of fighting the unknowable, we embrace it. Just this once. What if we consider that transness's resistance to scientific understanding is part of what makes it so compelling, and approach our theories as the creation myths they've been this whole time? That approach kind of blows the roof off this thing, and makes room for theories that do more for us, that offer not just a cause, but a reason for being alive. Sure, maybe you're trans because something's wrong with your DNA. Maybe you're trans so you can help other trans people. Maybe you're trans so you can have a lot of weird sex. I don't know. What I'm trying to get at is that uncertainty itself has a lot to offer those in need. A lot of the time, literal truth isn't what we're after. What we want is guidance. That note on my computer that I mentioned at the beginning, part of me knew it wasn't literally sent to me by the universe, right? I just really wanted it to be. At the time, I was freshly 18, a year out of the closet, and having a disastrous go at things for too many reasons to list. I handled my first year of college with all the elegance of a seagull in a jet engine, failing a few classes spectacularly, then crashing loudly. I had no faith in the future, no sturdy plans, few prospects. Suffice to say, I needed a guide. And here was this file, materialized from the ether, simple, sturdy, and definitive. Gone. It's gone forever. The statement was broad enough to take as an affirmation of almost anything I needed affirmed. My childhood was gone, my friends were gone, the person I used to be was gone. Not encouraging messages, but correct ones, compelling me to face the facts and move on. I returned to the file often, and each time it said true things. By now, that rough patch is several years behind me, and I'm well aware how silly all this sounds. Last month, I was reminded of the file, and I got to wondering, okay, where did that actually come from? If not a message from the universe, then where? I figured out what was up with the file format, which is a .text clipping. It turns out that Mac computers create these when you highlight text and drag it onto the desktop. I can see how this would have happened without me noticing. At the time, I had this tick where I would tap on my trackpad over and over and drag the cursor all over the place. I could have selected this phrase somewhere, then accidentally drag and dropped it onto the desktop. Weirdly vulnerable thing to admit, by the way. Please be normal about this in the comments. And with that made clear, I got to wondering where the phrase was clipped from. I copied it into Google and was surprised to find that once it's gone forever is a decently common phrase online. With every result I checked, I felt myself getting closer, and my world shrinking down to a single point. Reading the elusive phrase on Mormon news sites, in premium whiskey reviews, on magicalquote.com, the text file began to feel frivolous, and the real ways it had impacted my life, kind of pathetic. I realized no point of origin could possibly live up to the infinite meanings I'd imagined for it. So I stopped looking. Turns out I still need it to have meant something. There's not much comfort in this world for a newly out trans woman, let alone the messy one I used to be. It's still a real comfort to think I was worthy of that kind of attention, that an unseen force would have watched over me of all people. I can only imagine this is what Marx meant when he said that religion is the soul of soulless conditions, the opium of the people. I wonder if a yearning for this divine comfort that both science and organized religion deny us is what leads some to believe that trans people are closer to God, and maybe even that transness itself is divinely ordained. This idea seems to be in vogue lately. I've heard it from friends, from strangers online, most recently from graffiti in the bathroom of a lesbian bar. It's certainly not a new idea. Some version has popped up in many cultures throughout history. But the version I often hear is that trans people create themselves as God created humanity, and that the creation process is inherently transcendent. I think for people who need it, this affirms their transition as something beautiful and generative, not depraved and destructive as so many people portray it. It helps people affirm the real wisdom they've gained from living on the inside of this phenomenon, and gives them a framework to use that wisdom for good. It's not a formally organized belief. I'm sure there are drastically different takeaways than what I'm describing, and I'm sure those are valuable too. In any case, I have to admit I don't entirely vibe with the framing, because even lifting us up sets us apart from the rest of the world. If trans people come from anywhere, I think it's below, in the mud where particles fraternize and occasionally form something new. I think people like us are a lucky coincidence, one of those things that emerges as an ecosystem iterates. Marine mammals, bright feathered birds, sunflowers. trans people. The process isn't ordained by a higher power. It's a shared effort by all living things, causing one another with each interaction. Trans people emerge from the clay of the earth, like everyone else, and mold ourselves by some inconceivable blueprint, like everyone else. The most credit I'm willing to give us is that we're more actively involved in that process than most people, which can give us insights into just how created everything around us is. If you're open to learning, transition can teach you just how many things can be dismantled if they don't serve the world, and that there are powerful forces that still elude our understanding. To accept yourself as trans is to live, at least for a while, in contradiction. To realize you are something you're not yet. To recognize that a crucial part of yourself is absent from your life and body, but also that it's everywhere, coloring your interactions and desires for your whole life. What is that intangible something that knows who we are even before we can put our finger on it? I don't know, dude. That question is basically, what is the essence of the self? What is the soul? We start whole religions over this. Maybe it's physical, able to be localized somewhere and understood. Maybe it is a soul or the will of a higher power. Maybe it's nothing in particular, random chance, chaos. As long as the question is left unresolved, there are 8 billion true answers, each of which serves a real purpose in the mind of its beholder, whether or not it's strictly correct. Should we give all that up just so we can pat ourselves on the back and tell ourselves humans have no more worlds to conquer? Uncertainty births almost everything. Abiding its desire allows us to ask questions, create art, fall in love, transform ourselves beyond recognition. It's precious. And once it's gone forever. So I'm really comfortable writing nonfiction videos like this one, and I've always wanted to dip my toes into writing fiction too, but since I don't have any formal education, it's felt really intimidating. Thankfully, that's where Skillshare has been helping me out, the online learning community with something to offer people at all skill levels. I recently found a course called Writing Character-Driven Short Stories, which is helping me overcome this mental block I've had as long as I can remember. It's been really invigorating, and it's giving me a blueprint for turning all my jumbly, swirly ideas into an actual completed project. It's taught by Yi-Yun Lee, an acclaimed author and literal MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. So, I mean, no wonder it's great. Skillshare has courses that can help you grow in your creative practice or boost your career with new skills, but also stuff like, cooking, sewing, gardening, nice little things you can do for yourself. If you sign up with my link in the description, you can get a month of Skillshare totally free, which is enough time to take a ton of their courses and see all they have to offer. They're a genuinely really cool service, and I want to thank them for sponsoring the video. So, it turns out that coming on camera and bearing your soul is a lot harder than coming on camera and complaining about TikTok. Yeah, this is this is kind of a side of gender that I tend to neglect because it's really hard to back up in words. It's more vibesy, Anyway, I hope you got something out of it. It was really rewarding for me to put all this stuff into words. And of course, I especially want to thank my lovely supporters on Patreon, including Emily Martins, Tyler Bloom, Noah Hvistendahl, Ruby Landau Pincus, Marco, Gia Marina Caterina Santalucia, Peter Landers, Kadinger, Jem Violet, Chris, Cannon, Talia Parkinson, Callie Jennings, Chloe Jane, MJ is Gay for Spider-Gwen, Colin Coltrera, Remy Idol, Jane Malcolm, Momo, Cole, Evelyn Schmidt, Ali K, Shadow Disorder, Henry Rachutin, Desperi Wertanen, Taylor Hardy, Alejandro Hernandez, Emerson, Linda Jewers, Sandy Smith, Smaz Ruby, Hannah Leichnitz, Nick Muggio, Ivy, Izzy, Caitlin, Charlie H, Jade Persuades, Matilde, Sasha Karpachinsky, Joe Liss, Coralie, Megahertz, Mid-Tier Art, Wimble-Limble, Guillaume, Frogsmore, Fox Auslander, Visprin Dojos, Duck Rose Chilies, Honor Ash, Wesley Potts, The Numeral 1, Square 44, Joe Azar, Amelia G, Jesse Earl, Emma Casley, Nick Ciara, Blueberry Hill, Harmony, Lee Sloth Pope, ZHL, Quinn Osgood, Catherine Ann McCloskey Ross, Arden Quartz, Alicia, Stella, Sophie, Quillworth, Non-Anonymous, Aisling, Mary Wishart, Rose V. Dale, Stina Carey, Vivian, Erica Peterson, Samari Braley, Rachel Ann, Borger, Nao Kiyoshi, Henry, Kiki, Rhea Chappell, The Evil James, Gwen Loffman, Rose Juliet, Olivia Grimes, Kaylin Aaron, Escher, Joel Durham, Scott Sometimes Lucy, Rika Coy, The Recognition Scene, June Safri, Dan Lizotte, Celeste Blossom, Morgan Batan, Ben Chalada, Tracy Runan Intel, Aria Bend, Cassie, Callan, Lillian, Caroline Matheson, River, Spencer Anderson McGilligot, Clara Griffin, Darla Butler, and finally, Erin Laura. We did it, baby. That's gender. Bye.